Now, because we are thrilled about what promises to be a fascinating discussion, without any further delay, I would like immediately to give the floor to Dr. Laure Ognois, who is Director of Research Services at the University of Geneva, who will chair our first panel entitled Disinformation, Scientific Integrity and Whistleblowing. Dear Laure, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Costa. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laure Ognois. I'm the Director of the Research Services at the University of Geneva, and I'm very pleased and honored to chair the panel on disinformation, scientific integrity, and whistleblowing. I will start with a short introduction of our 5 panelists. After that, the panelists will have the opportunity to present. And following their presentation, we will have the opportunity of a Q&A session of about 15 minutes. I will start with Dr. Virginia Burkett. She is Chief Scientist for Climate and Land Use Change at the US Geological Survey. She was formerly the USGS Associate Director for Climate and Land Use Change and Chair of the US Global Change Research Program. She has published extensively on the topics of climate change and has served on over 70 commissions, science panels, and boards during her career. Before federal service, Virginia was the director of the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Second, Dr. Babakinejad. Babak holds a PhD in neuroscience and nanotechnology from Imperial College London and a Master of Science in psychiatry, as well as a bachelor in molecular genetics from King's College London. In his capacity as research scientist and research lead at MIT, he was a whistleblower with respect to public safety concerns on the lack of scientific integrity as MIT's Open Agriculture Initiative. He previously served as Research Ethics Committee expert member in the UK and worked at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, focusing on developing ultra-sensitive genomics technology. The third expert is Professor Frits Rosendaal, who is Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the Leiden University Medical Center in the Netherlands, where he chairs the Department of Clinical Epidemiology. He studied medicine in Rotterdam and obtained his PhD at Leiden University. Frits is currently co-chairman of the Committee on Scientific Integrity of the Leiden University Medical Center and University Leiden, member of the Council of the Committee on Publications Ethics, member of the Central Committee on Research Involving Human Subjects, and last but not least, chair of the Laure Policy Group on Scientific Integrity. Peter Doshi is an associate professor of pharmaceutical health services research at the University of Maryland's School of Pharmacy and a senior editor at the British Medical Journal. His research focuses on the drug approval process and improving the credibility and accuracy of evidence synthesis and biomedical publications. Peter leads the Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials initiative, which aims to ensure clinical trial publications are accurate, complete, and data are publicly available. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University and received his PhD from the MIT. Finally, Dr. Don Carpenter is a business ethicist and a practitioner fellow at Georgetown University. She is a former investment banker to some of the most venerable social purpose corporations and is one of the leading voices of the solidarity economy movement. Her podcasts have reached nearly 250,000 downloads in over 30 countries. She is a senior advisor to several solidarity economy projects at the Vatican and serves on the investment committee of the American Society of Microbiology. Dr. Carpenter earned her doctorate from Georgetown University for work in contributive justice theory. She holds additional graduate degrees in public finance, political science, and satellite theology. So now I think we can start with the presentation, and I'm delighted to give the floor to Virginia.
Thank you so much. My name is Virginia Burkett. I'm Chief Scientist for Climate and Land Use Change at the U.S. Department of the Interior in the U.S. Geological Survey. And I've worked at the DOI for 32 years. I've published roughly 80 scientific articles, book chapters, and reports on wetlands and climate change. I was a lead author of the IPCC's 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessment reports, the IPCC technical paper on water, and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd U.S. national climate assessments, which are reports required by an act of the U.S. Congress. In 2015, I competed for and was promoted to the position of USGS Associate Director for Climate and Land Use Change. In 2016, I was appointed co-chair and later served as chair of the coordinating body for the $2.6 billion U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP, that involves the work of 13 federal agencies. When the Trump administration took office, I was leading a vibrant research program consisting of 8 regional climate science centers, a climate R&D program, a land change science program, and 2 Landsat satellite missions. As chair of the USGCRP coordinating body, I oversaw the production of the 4th National Climate Assessment, and I was the Department of Interior's representative on the steering committee for that highly influential report. Soon after the January 2017 inauguration, I witnessed and fought a direct assault on climate science within the USGS. The assaults came in 3 forms. The first assault was on the budget for our climate research program. In early 2017, I was ordered by newly installed political appointees to develop a budget request to the Congress that would cut our programmatic funding in half. I described the programmatic and staffing impacts in the budget narrative and was later ordered to delete those impact statements. I was told by that the DOI budget officer, quote, was pissed, end quote, about my repeated appeals and assertions that the impact of the budget reduction would be obscured by the removal of information that I had submitted in the impact statements. The second class of assault on science had to do with political appointees altering scientific documents by inserting language that either downplayed the role of human activity in climate change or by casting doubt on our assessments of climate change and impacts. I witnessed and fought attempts by DOI officials to alter reports produced by the USGS and the Bureau of Reclamation. Such attempts are in direct violation of USGS scientific integrity policy. But the most egregious of the interferences occurred as we neared production of the 4th National Climate Assessment in 2018. After 2 years of work, the 300+ authors had completed their report and responded to formal reviews by the national academies, as well as peer public and federal agency reviews. Political appointees at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, which is one of the 13 agencies in the USGCRP, they were attempting to change the summary findings of the report. Rather than accept the changes, I wrote to the NOAA principal expressing my concerns. I told him that the edits were not consistent with the contents of the report, and they would undermine the summary findings and the report in general. I later convened a meeting of the agency principals and asked our executive director to invite a White House attorney to meet with us and hear our concerns. In a roundtable fashion, I and the other agency representatives expressed serious concerns about the proposed edits and the lack of transparency in the process. After that meeting, the White House counsel, Rachel Leonard, told me that she, quote, felt the pain in the room, end quote. I wrote to the NOAA principal expressing the consensus of the USGCRP agencies. In the end, the NCA was published as written by the authors without a single word change. We were instructed, however, to release our report on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving in 2018, an obvious attempt to downplay the report in the media, but that plan backfired. About 300 media outlets joined the press call. Many journalists expressed dismay and disgust about the timing of the release. They wanted to know who in the administration had made that decision. The third variety of assault on science was disinformation. The political appointees who ran my department undermined public confidence in climate science with misleading public statements that cast doubt on the findings of the National Climate Assessment and the fact that human activities are altering the Earth's climate. These were communicated by the Secretary of the Interior and the President. In response to a journalist's question about the impacts described in the National Climate Assessment, the President said, quote, I don't believe it, end quote. And according to the White House press secretary, the report was, quote, not based on facts, end quote. In 5 months, in 2017, 5 months after the inauguration, I was abruptly removed from my position as associate director and reassigned to work as an assistant to an unknown political appointee at Interior headquarters. The Climate and Land Use Change Mission Area was dismantled and its remaining employees dispersed to other mission areas in the USGS. In 2019, the USGS director, a presidential appointee, had me removed as chair of USGCRP leadership. He told me that I had become a, quote, target of the administration. There's not time to describe the hostile environment that I endured for 4 years and the effects on me personally. It's more important that I share with you some practical lessons that I learned through all of this. If you witness an assault on scientific integrity and are unable to deal with it on your own, number one, find allies. For me, it was our USGS Office of Scientific Integrity and my career colleagues who represented their agencies on the USGCRP. The scientist who led the National Climate Assessment and our USGCRP Executive Director provided moral and technical support at every turn. Number two, keep records. Politically motivated individuals may persuade you or even threaten your research if it does not support their political views, but generally they're not willing to put their instructions in writing. If they insist in verbal communications that you do something unethical, simply say, no, I can't do that. Be sure to document these interactions with contemporaneous notes, or email yourself a message if you want to document something that happened on a certain date. Number three, never compromise on matters of scientific integrity. One small violation could lead to others and compromise your ability to say no. Take that demotion if your integrity is the cost you pay to stay. Number four, know your institution's scientific integrity rules and your rights to defend your science. If your scientific integrity is not directly compromised as a result of your efforts, you still may suffer retaliation and harassment in the workplace. And finally, number five, seek legal assistance if necessary. A scientist at the National Park Service gave me some good advice a couple of years ago when he told me that I needed to speak with a lawyer in one of the groups that defends government employees. I contacted an organization called the Governmental Accountability Project and obtained legal representation from a team of experienced whistleblower attorneys. They developed a detailed complaint and guided me through tough decisions, drawing on decades of experience in defending public servants like me. I'm fortunate to work for a science agency with a strong scientific integrity policy. I remain deeply concerned, however, that the damage done to USGS climate science will take years to repair and restore. Our remaining climate science is scattered and uncoordinated at this point, but we're working on that. I am forever hopeful that integrity and principled leadership will prevail and that our commitment to accurate, relevant, and accessible science will never waver. I hope that sharing my experience will be an encouragement to others who may not know what to do when the integrity of their work is threatened. That's why I agreed to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for your words, your talk, and your impressive testimony. I give now the floor to Babak. Babak, you can start.
1 second, sorry.
Okay, I think we have a technical problem with the, I suggest that Frits continue. Frits, if you're ready.
Yeah, I am. Let me find the screen to share, which should be this one. Can you see it, Laure?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, so I will be speaking. Hello, everyone. I'm a medical doctor, so some of my examples will be, or language will be slightly medical. I will speaking from the perspective of a chairman of a committee on scientific integrity. And this title I was given, Whistleblowers as Safeguards of Scientific Truth, the position of academic institutions. So here and there, I will go back to that title. Well, let's talk just briefly about scientific integrity and what a committee like mine does. So scientific integrity is laid down in codes of conduct. Many countries have those. There's a European code, of course, and there's one in the Netherlands. It concerns knowledge institutes, mainly universities, who underwrite that code. And although those codes are long, you might summarize them, but they focus on truthfulness. So have the data been tampered with or something like that, data fabrication, and acknowledgement. Are the authors really the authors, and are there no authors who have not really contributed? Or is there no plagiarism? If you look at the pyramid of scientific integrity, there is obviously good research. Then there is research that's not really good, sloppy research, or not very relevant. That's research waste. That is not yet scientific misconduct. That's just, although we wouldn't like it too much, it's scientific quality. Scientific misconduct classically consists of, as I said already, fabrication of data, falsification of data, which is both affecting the truthfulness of the results, and plagiarism, which is about stealing from someone else. And committees like mine, they investigate complaints of breaches of scientific integrity. And why do we do that? I think our main purpose is not to punish people, but it's to cleanse the scientific body of knowledge. So if there are data there, results there that are not true, they should be removed, and to correct incorrect attribution, like in plagiarism. A little bit about language. In the Netherlands, we have a different whistleblower means something else than complainant. And I think originally in English it was the same, but now it seems they are used exchangeably, which is fine, but still it is important, I think. But thus a whistleblower is called a klokkenluider, someone who rings a bell, makes a sound too, and that concerns a system fault. I have two examples, both from the Netherlands, that are actual. Like a Department of Fiscal Law has professors paid by law firms who set the research agenda. Obviously, you don't want that. That's a system fault. A neurology professor is leading research into an Alzheimer medicine, but also co-owns a capital investment firm that is investing in that same drug. A complainant, a klager in Dutch, concerns a single case. So we get a single case that comes to a committee like ours, like a psychologist who fakes data, or a rheumatologist who discover a new type of rheumatoid arthritis. And I think this difference is relevant, whether it's a system fault or a single case, because we are going to talk about the position of institutes, and it affects the position of institutes, and it affects what happens. So institutions are more hesitant to tackle system errors than single breaches, and sometimes they even can't tackle system errors because they don't have the power to do so. But there is of course, they affect each other. Single breaches of scientific integrity are facilitated by system errors. For instance, if a university encourages public-private partnerships, this may go wrong. If there are no clear rules or regulations, and also if there are perverse impulses, like your promotion depends on how many grants you get. But of course, sometimes this is not the case. There are cases of fraud that are really standing alone, and those are individuals where it's very difficult to find a panacea, my first medical term, or a complete solution. You cannot change the system and make it so good that you can avoid everything, prevent everything. In the title, it says whistleblowers or complainants as safeguards of scientific integrity. Well, that is so, perhaps. But they're only one of many safeguards, of course. There are internal safeguards, or there should be. There should be education on scientific integrity. People should know what they could do and what they could not do, and it should be internalized. There should be an open culture with intervision between scientists, so that not the single person cannot be fraudulent. And there should be a lack or minimization of perverse impulses and undue pressure. Externally, there are policies on research funding that could affect, if there's very much pressure there too, would affect scientific misconduct, policies on research dissemination, and as we talked about later, investigative journalists. So I see not whistleblowers as a safeguard. I think they are the ultimum refugium, as that's called in medicine, the final medication, and everything else has failed. So they are a safety net rather than safeguard. And in an ideal world, you would not need whistleblowers, especially because of the hardships that they often go through. Because there is a risk of retaliation. And that is because whistleblowers and complainants are perceived as harmful to the organization, and they are perceived as disloyal. And both are more so when it's a system fault than a single case. Obviously, when it's a system fault, the institute cannot point a finger at only one individual who was fraudulent, but apparently the institute itself has mistakes, so the board doesn't like that. And of course, if people all act together in fraudulent or questionable practices, then it becomes a group conscience, and then someone who breaks that group again is perceived as more disloyal. So that leads to a paradox that the greater the problem, the less likely positive action. The greater the probability it is a system fault, there will be the more hesitancy or resistance to do anything about it. And I think, as a note in my work as a chairman of the Committee on Scientific Integrity, it's really important to know there's always more. Not all complainants are completely selfless. There may be fights laying behind it in a way that doesn't matter, but there's often something else. Often whistleblowers and complainants do not follow procedures when there are procedures. That makes it difficult. And they're always, in all our cases, the emotions are present from the beginning, and they increase exponentially. Who are damaged? Everybody is damaged. The accused is damaged. These are emotional, painful investigations. even when in the end we find it unfounded. Co-authors are damaged. The institution is damaged, so that's why they may retaliate. Journals are damaged, and I give an example I wrote below. You can read an article in Retraction Watch that I wrote. It took us 5 years to get a article retracted, which was completely fabricated. And grant agencies are damaged, their image is damaged. And in the same case, the ERC has still not withdrawn funding, which was based on a fraudulent grant. And in the end, obviously, as we've heard and will hear again, the complainant or whistleblower may suffer, and his damage is often damaged, and science as a whole is damaged. The trust in science is damaged. What are institutional actions to minimize immediate damage? And these are the negative actions, obviously. It's procrastination, to postpone, like the journal that took 5 years to retract an article. Obfuscation, to make it unclear. And elimination, basically to fire or cancel people. This is the report of in my own institute, so we are not better than everybody else. My own institute, this is the report we had where we said that articles should be retracted, but you can't see which articles. This is a nice page. This page in the report is even worse. So we send a report that was readable, but it comes into the public unreadable. I have to say something about dilemmas and remedies. Well, if we, in what we do, well, it's simple when the complaint is either not true or when we find it founded. That's simple. But some complaints are very serious, but not about scientific integrity, so we cannot look into them. Some complaints may well be true, but they're not sufficiently proven, which is unpleasant. And also we have decided many committees do not to allow anonymous complaints, but they might still be true. And finally, this is my final slide. What are the remedies? And I think these are the minimal conditions. Any institute should have clear rules and procedures. People should know what to do, and people should know how to complain and where to get. And that should, of course, be by an investigational committee that has expertise and is independent. There should be transparency. People should hear what they know. The trial should not be like Kafka's trial, but also the results should be clear. Complainants should be protected, obviously. Accused should also be protected because it may not be true and they need not to be punished more than necessary. And in the end, it's courage. And it's not only courage of the whistleblower. That's the first courage, but maybe also the last because it's the ultimate refugium. But there should also be courage of the board of directors of any institute to not go for the immediate minimization of damage, but to really act on complaints that are founded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frits, for a very clear presentation. I give now the floor to Peter.
All right, thank you very much. Let me start sharing some slides here. So hopefully you can see them. So I come from the world of academia. I work at University of Maryland School of Pharmacy and also for the BMJ as a medical journal editor. So I'm coming from this world of medicine, drugs, vaccines, and the regulatory drug approval process. And I was asked to speak about the BMJ's investigation into poor practices occurring at a Texan company that was contracted to work on the Pfizer COVID vaccine trial in the second half of 2020. So I'll present that story as well as the aftermath of that story, which ties into the issue of misinformation, but perhaps in a slightly unexpected way. So the story came to us from a whistleblower named Brooke Jackson, who worked for a contract research company called Ventavia, which ran 3 of the clinical trial sites for Pfizer's vaccine. And Ventavia enrolled more than 1,000 participants into the 44,000 person trial. Jackson, the whistleblower, alleged that Ventavia had falsified data, had unblinded patients, employed inadequately trained vaccinators, and was slow to follow up on adverse events. But Jackson didn't just bring these allegations to us. She provided the BMJ with company emails, internal documents, text messages, photos, recordings of her conversations with other company employees. So it was a very solid case. And so this photo, for example, shows vaccine packaging materials that were just left out in the open. And this is not good. This was a blinded trial, which means that to ensure the validity of the results, neither the participants nor the investigators should know whether the participant got vaccine or placebo. But these cartons that you can see in the picture clearly identify whether something's vaccine or placebo, and the patient's ID number is written on it. The way this is supposed to work is that the only people who could see these cartons were the unblinded staff who actually delivered the vaccine, the injection, but then were otherwise not involved in the trial. So this picture you can see is a sort of visually arresting way to understand how unblinding could occur. But you'll see in this next slide here that at Ventavia, the unblinding may have occurred on a far wider scale. So what you're seeing here is a document containing instructions for Ventavia staff, which are highlighted in pink, instructing the staff to file each of the trial participants' randomization and drug assignment confirmation sheets into each participant's chart. So again, what we have here is unblinded information that allows one to figure out whether the person got vaccine or placebo, and staff were being instructed to place a copy of that sheet into the participants' charts. So unblinding, I think, as everybody knows or may guess, creates serious concerns about data integrity. Once this massive error was discovered, Ventavia asked the staff to go through each and every chart to take out the randomization and drug assignment confirmations. So what you're seeing here is an email from Ventavia's chief operating officer reacting after discovery of the problem. What's clear is that Ventavia management had not, until the whistleblower started raising questions about this, even realized that the drug assignment confirmation sheets contained unblinded information. So in the heat of a pandemic, I think it's not hard to understand or imagine that some places were not doing science just quickly, but perhaps rushing faster than was acceptable. Places where corners were cut and mistakes were made. Some mistakes are going to be benign, but other mistakes carry serious consequences to data integrity. And I very much hope that Ventavia is an extreme outlier here, but the public obviously needs more than just hope. We need evidence that the data were dealt with properly. Pfizer has said that it didn't identify any issues that would invalidate the data, but what we really need to know is, what does an independent regulatory body think? That's what regulatory oversight is for. But unfortunately, the reason Jackson, the whistleblower, came to us is precisely because the FDA did not thoroughly investigate. Despite a direct complaint that Jackson made to the FDA never inspected Ventavia. In fact, the FDA only inspected 9 of the trial's 150 plus sites before approving the vaccine, just 9 sites. And Pfizer continues to use Ventavia for trials. That was the BMJ story. And the BMJ Commission and award-winning investigative reporter, Paul Thacker, to write the story. And we published it on the 2nd of November last year, following legal review, external peer review, and the eyes of numerous editors. And it received record traffic, millions of readers. And for those of you that know about altmetrics for scientific publications, it has the 2nd highest altmetric of any article in history. But then a week later, readers began reporting a variety of problems when trying to share our article. Some reported being unable to share it. Many others reported having their posts flagged with a warning about missing context. Independent fact checkers say this information could mislead people. Those who are trying to post the article were informed by Facebook that people who repeatedly share the quote false information might have their posts move lower in Facebook's newsfeed. And group administrators, you can see on the right side of the slide, group administrators where the article was shared, they received messages from Facebook informing them that such posts were, quote, partly false. And all of this was triggered by a fact check, but it really isn't quite unbelievable fact check. The title itself of this fact check is nonsensical. Have a read. Inaccurate, incompetent, and irresponsible are the three words that our editors-in-chief used to describe it. It called, this fact check called the BMJ a news blog. It published the story on its website under a URL that contained the phrase hoax alert. But most importantly, it failed to provide a single assertion of fact that the BMJ article got wrong. Instead, it took to undermining the credibility of the whistleblower as if the story somehow just rested upon her word and not the many actual trial documents the BMJ obtained from the whistleblower. But this fact check is what led Facebook to take these actions against our article. And despite our appeals to lead stories and to Facebook, including an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg, the errors relating to Facebook's tagging of our article have not been corrected, and Zuckerberg didn't respond. So I think this whole case that I've presented here today highlights a kind of important and concerning intersection where whistleblowers and fact-checking meet in a kind of unexpected and unfortunate way. The BMJ published fully fact-checked journalism based on a trove of materials brought to it by a whistleblower documenting serious problems occurring at certain trial sites involved in one of the world's most important clinical trials. The story thus affirms the crucial role of whistleblowers. But the story, or post-publication story, also shines a light on the power of fact-checking companies to shape the social media environment in ways that are not healthy and should worry readers. So I think this story suggests we need to take a very broad view of the problem of misinformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation and this detailed story. And finally, I'm delighted to give the floor to Dawn.
Hello, my name is Dr. Dawn Carpenter with Georgetown University. Unlike the esteemed colleagues on the panel, I do not come from a science background. I come from a finance background, and I am a business ethicist and am the host and executive producer of a podcast called What Does It Profit? What Does It Profit is a question that comes to us from biblical literature that suggests asking the moral question, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? So as you might imagine, this gives us a wide variety of topics to cover. So as part of this research project, Whistling at the Fake, we were asked to develop a podcast episode that helped to tell the story of the value of truth in science. And in doing so, we wanted to bring a unique set of voices. So thank you very much for advancing the slides for me. I have a little bit of COVID fog. I contracted COVID just a few days ago. So bear with me, and thanks, Laure, for advancing the slides for me. So what we decided to do in preparing this episode was to think about what domain of science would be most relevant to our broad non-science-based audience. We are a podcast that's internationally distributed, so anyone in the world who has access to a podcast platform can hear us and can actually see us on YouTube. And so we wanted something very broad, so we chose public health and what could be more pressing in public health than COVID-19. We began to develop this episode in December of 2021. And so that was just as Omicron was beginning to become a very dominant part of the COVID experience. And so we thought, who could help us tell an aspect or a story in the public health aspects of COVID-19 that gave us a unique voice? And so we wanted a female scientist as our unique lead voice. And we also were looking at, in our world, we try to structure our content around what may be relevant in the public discourse in the future, which is a very difficult thing to predict, as we all certainly know, and in this case learned as well. But looking at March being Women's History Month, and it was also the time of the second anniversary of the World Health Organization's declaration of the global pandemic. So we thought those two things together might help lift our storytelling. And so our story frame, which as storytellers, what we do is we try to develop a theme around an episode, and ours is an interview style podcast. And so as the host, I am engaged in conversation with one or more guests in a given episode. And so we wanted to think about whistleblowing and how could we talk about it in a way that could engage a non-science audience when we're talking about a science story. And so we wanted to think about an aspect of whistleblowing because most people are familiar with the concept of a whistleblower. But we wanted to talk about a dimension of whistleblowing that might be a little bit different. So we focused on what we understand to be an outside whistleblower. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And to discuss the topics of disinformation and misinformation to make sure that the listeners understood the different nuances. And then we wanted to see if there was a gender dynamic, because again, we were targeting this for release during Women's History Month. And then we wanted also a story that focused on the impact of social media. And in all of this, we wanted to talk to the whistleblower, but we wanted also to acknowledge that there is this importance of allies. And we paired our guest with an important ally in that person's story. And then ultimately our goal is to inform, to entertain, and to inspire. So advance the slide, please. Laure, could you please advance the slide?
I'm trying, but it doesn't work, unfortunately.
Let's see, perhaps I can share my screen.
If you can try, it would be great.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind stop sharing yours so that I can share mine.
Yes.
So what we learn in media is that there are always technical difficulties.
That's okay for you now, Dan?
Let's see. It still says that you are sharing.
Yes, Laura, we can still see your screen.
Sorry for that.
So as we're working.
Okay.
Now it should
Okay.
work, I guess.
Okay, very good. Yes, I will share my screen.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your patience. So to describe our process.
Sorry, we don't see the presentation. We see the folder where the file is included, but we don't see your presentation.
I see my presentation.
Okay.
Let's try this again.
First put the presentation on and then share the screen.
Mm-hmm. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you all again for your patience. So in our pre-production work, what we do as show producers is to do our own research. So our research is not in the scientific way that has been described by our colleagues here in the panel. It's more from a journalistic type perspective. And so in our research, we review public documents. We, in the course of preparing this podcast, we also looked at more technical literature than we would in other topics that we do. And then our producer and our show researcher actually did pre-interviews with the guests. And then after reviewing, and those are all recorded. And so after reviewing that, as executive producer and with our producer, I re-reviewed those pre-interviews. And so what we did then was to develop, begin to assess the themes. And the themes were emerging fairly clearly in this particular episode. And what then happened is that we took the themes that were developed and reviewed those themes with external independent ethicists in microbiology. And as was described in my introduction, or the introduction about me, I sit on the investment committee of the American Society of Microbiology. This is my second term, so fourth year in that role. So I am an expert in financial management for social purpose organizations, and the American Society of Microbiology is the largest scientific society in the United States. And so I'm very familiar with the financial aspects of that organization, but also what it does. And so had access to the ethicists there. And so we had an external interview process there that never literally made it on the show, but informed how we organized the conversation and how we scripted the episode. So the third part in our pre-production work is actually scripting and writing the questions and all the work that gets done before recording. So who did we talk to? We were in conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Beck and Dr. Ivan Oransky. And for those of you who do not know, Dr. Beck has gained quite a great deal of notoriety during the height of the, well, hate to even say height because who knows where the pandemic is going, but during the beginning part and the very, very public part of the process of dealing with the political aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the battle that ensued after the disclosure of faulty science behind the use of hydroxychloroquine as a potential panacea for the pandemic promoted by former President Donald Trump. And so Dr. Beck had shared her story of identifying the data that caused the concern for the validity of what ended up being a very small study, but very high profile study, suggesting that hydroxychloroquine was more efficacious than the study would, or a perhaps better designed study could have proven it to be. And so she tells that story. And then Dr. Ivan Oransky, I identify him here in the slide as an ally, but hopefully those of you in the scientific world are quite familiar with his work as well, being the co-founder of Retraction Watch. And so Ivan shared his insights about whistleblowing and about how whistleblowers inform the work that he does, but also his reaction to Elizabeth's experience. And so when we were in conversation, a number of themes emerged. One of the themes related to this concept of being an outside whistleblower. And the distinction was made versus being an inside whistleblower, someone within an organization or a company. An outsider is someone who finds a set of problems as an external party, and then brings those issues to fore. And a secondary theme, perhaps maybe a unique part of the value of this particular podcast was the discussion that we had about the experience of whistleblowers through a gendered lens. And so Dr. Beck had shared her experiences online, and online, not only the torture she endured on Twitter, which included being what we call doxed, which is the release of your personal contact information. And she was actually received death threats, and there was concern for her safety. And so she has shared that, but she also shared the very difficult experience she had as a woman. And we related that to a conversation with Dr. Horansky, who shared an experience that he had had with another whistleblower who was not only a woman, but also was a person of color. And so we talk about the dynamics experience with whistleblowers from varying positions of power. And then through Dr. Beck's story, we were able to talk about what whistleblowing looks like on a world stage, where it's quite one thing when you're dealing with perhaps a scientist to scientist. There was a French scientist at the heart of the controversy on the flawed studies in hydroxychloroquine. So it's one thing for Dr. Beck and this French doctor to be in dialogue. It's quite another thing when it blows up on Twitter and there is actually world leaders engaged in this activity. So we talk about that dynamic. We talk about the dynamic of having allies and partners. And I think Virginia, in her talk earlier in the session, explained the importance of having allies in this process. And so Dr. Beck explained that as well. The other theme that came out, I call it bricks in the wall. This is a metaphor that Dr. Beck used in our conversation about the importance of good science. And those of you who work in the scientific community know this intuitively. This may be in large part why you got into science. But the idea that each piece of scientific research builds upon the next. And she explains, she answers the quintessential show question, what does it profit? What does it profit? That question was asked to her, and you can listen to the episode to hear it in her words. But essentially what she explained is that science becomes something else when it's built on a weak foundation. And so that's a theme that I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to listen to in her words. And then finally, information flows and incentives in science journalism. And this was, in my view, a very important aspect of the episode that came out in dialogue with Dr. Horansky. And he talked about some very concerning issues related to what he sees as real challenges in how information flows throughout the scientific community. And he talked about the role of the journals. He's actually editor of a number of them, and works in in all aspects. The beginning of the beginning of the gate, and on the other side of the gate. And so he shares his thoughts on that, and talks about the types of incentives that drive behavior in science journalism, and equates that also with some of the incentives that he sees in the scientific community, whether it's working within an educational institution or within pharma or in varying places within the scientific community. And so these were the themes that we used, or that came out rather, in our discussion. So if you would like to listen to the episode, yourself. Oh, well, here, let me explain before I do that. The release, we released on March 9th, which we had timed to be the beginning of Women's History Month. And also we are a Wednesday release show. And this was the Wednesday before the Friday, which would have marked the 2-year anniversary of the World Health Organization's declaration of the global pandemic. Challenge for us is that we operate in a big, broad world. And what was going on that week, that was the beginning of the invasion of the Ukraine. And actually, we had recorded an alternative beginning of the episode that talked about the importance of truth generally, because we were reading reports out of Russia and the disinformation that was going on in Russia about the nature of the Ukrainian invasion. We opted to, for clarity's purposes, although we were all very juiced up about it, not to have that as the beginning of our episode. So that's a little bit of the inside dynamic of our show production, but that's what our episode was competing against. And I guess I'll wrap up just by letting you know what we were able to produce in terms of listeners. As of yesterday, just a little bit over 9,000 downloads through the listening apps. YouTube were close to 3,000 listeners there. And our back office data collection is somewhat limited, but it can tell us where our listeners are coming from. And so we had a very broad listeners. In some of these 107 countries, it may have just been one soul, but there was a listener there. But most of our downloads came from the United States, Iran, Germany, Canada, and the UK. And we mentioned here that Castbox, if you're not familiar with, it's the largest by download numbers app for people who use Android-based phones. And so Castbox listed us when we released as a staff favorite. And so hopefully people had been introduced to this episode that may not have previously found us. So if you'd like to listen to the episode, there's a QR code in orange here. You can take a picture of it on your screen, and that way you can listen to it through our website. But if you have your own podcast app that you like, you can listen to it anywhere you get podcasts. You can find us on Twitter or LinkedIn. And I guess if you have a show idea, if you're a whistleblower out there and want to get your story out, we are independent media, so we don't have a lot of the challenges of going through the larger media production companies. This allows us to tell stories that sometimes might not be heard. So thank you for letting us share.
Thank you very much, Don, for your impressive presentation on your project and for being with us despite your COVID. Now, before coming to the discussion, I would like to warmly thank all the panelists for their great contribution. And I think we can now open the door for the question and answer session. Before giving the floor to the audience, I would like to ask if there are questions the panelists want to ask to each other or to other panelists. Yes, Frits.
Yeah, a comment on what Dawn just said, because the story of Elizabeth Big, so I know her well. She was also harassed by Didier Raoult from France, and that's an example. On my last slide, I put the word courage there. So he wrote a fraudulent article in a journal. The journal didn't retract it. The editorial board, so that was the editorial board of the journal that had no courage. Is owned by a scientific society that didn't show courage, and it's published by a publisher, by Elsevier, who didn't show courage. So if people on the good side don't show courage, then these things can happen, I think. So it's not only white and black, but we play a role as bystanders, or others play a role as bystanders who should not stand and do nothing, which I think was a problem here.
Thank you, Frits. I didn't get into that detail, but that's an important part of the story.
Thank you. Any other questions from the panelist side? I don't see any hand raised. So I think it's a good moment to start giving the floor to the audience for question. Please raise your hands if you have any question. Present. Feel free to present your presentation to us.
Sure. I apologize for the difficulties I had.
No problem. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I just try to be very brief. Do you guys see the screen?
No, we
Hello?
can't at the
Yes.
moment. Now it's good.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here and talk about my experience at MIT. I just wanted to give a brief background about myself. I trained as a scientist in the UK, and I had postdoctoral training at the Broad Institute. In 2017, I was invited to join MIT Open Agriculture Initiative. So Open Agriculture Initiative was one of the high-profile projects of MIT Media Lab. The product that they had was called food computers. Food computers were supposed to create these controlled environments that you can grow plants, and basically. The problem was when I joined, MIT was already raising millions of dollars. So MIT president was taking this project around the world to raise unrestricted funding for the institute. There were a book chapter about the project in a Springer Nature. Money was raised from the World Food Program to send the devices to the refugee camps. It was supposedly to help refugees with growing food that they miss from their hometowns. A State Department funded the project. So Secretary Kerry made an announcement about deployment of food computers to Vietnam to help them with cutting edge agricultural technologies. When I joined the group, I was very excited because it was sounded like a very promising project at MIT. But soon after, I realized the devices were not working. So as I started, I noticed that the claims that are made about the project are also false. And these claims were made to US government officials, to sponsors, to journalists, to members of the public. And these dysfunctional devices, I mean, they were not working as advertised and presented. They were being sent to schools. And so this is a picture of food computers at MIT Media Lab, where they were being presented to the sponsors to do fundraising. It was very shocking to me to realize that plants were bought from the stores, we placed in the boxes to present them as if they were grown inside them, but they were actually either bought from the store or were like extracted from campus grounds. So this was going against my values that I held, and I thought it's a betrayal of the scientific process. So I did everything I can to fix the problem while I was at the MIT, to try to put procedures in place to make sure we can validate what we are promoting. Unfortunately, when I brought this, when I was trying to fix this, I was receiving a lot of pushbacks by the leadership. So when I brought these concerns to the attention of the leadership, they didn't necessarily take any appropriate action, and I was feeling that I'm being pushed aside. At the same time, I discovered that our group is also dumping thousands of gallons of fertilizers into the drinking water sources of residents of Massachusetts. That was extremely concerning to me. So when I brought that up, immediately I was cut off. I was not allowed I was basically prohibited from interacting with my collaborators, and I was basically removed from all the research processes I was involved in. I was adamant to bring this, I saw this as a great risk for the Institute, and I thought the leadership is not aware, so I did everything I can to bring it to their attention. But unfortunately, as time passed on, I realized that instead of addressing these problems, they continued the promotion of the project, and they also continued the dumping of the chemicals and misleading the regulators of Massachusetts, which was very surprising to me. And it was at that point that I realized that there is no other, basically all the investigative processes seem not to be working. So I had no choice but to speak to the press. So I provided all the supporting documents to the journalists who investigated them, and I spoke to the witnesses, and basically they started publishing stories about the issues at the Media Lab. It was only after the issues related to scientific misconduct, fundraising, fraudulent fundraising activities, and harming of the environment was exposed that MIT was forced to shut down the project. Basically, yeah, so I think at the moment I'm in the middle of, in the midst of a lawsuit with MIT. I didn't want to be here, but I'm trying to seek accountability through the justice system. And I think it's very important if you want to have processes in place to support whistleblowers, and also to basically to have independent oversight mechanisms so these problems do not happen. Thank you very much. And I have a lot of documents I'm happy to share with everyone and speak with and answer any questions after the talk.
Thank you very much, Babak. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. It's very courageous. Thank you very much. I am sure we have a few minutes more time for questions. So please go ahead, raise your hand if you have any question.
Yeah, I have a question. Babak,
Please, Gustav.
Babak, I have a question for you. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. So what do you think was the issue at MIT? Is there any issue in relation to elitist education? The position of MIT as a top university, how it in a way helped disinformation to go around. Can you please explore this with us?
So MIT is considered one of the top, the top #1 institute in the world. It's and it has a lot of, basically they have the authority of, they're considered like an authority. So one of the issues with scientific integrity is the fact that there is this over-reliance on trust into the academic institutions. The main issue is that the recipient of the information, such as the readers or even the journalists, they don't have the expertise to verify the information they receive. And I think that's a relatively a big concern. So, and unfortunately, in the case of the food computer project, this is an example of like a breach of that trust that took place. And the other problem is that MIT has a lot of connections and influence, and it's like very wealthy and powerful. So there is also this reluctance by the regulators for various reasons not to investigate some of these issues the way the way they investigated with a smaller corporations. I think these are some of the reasons.
Thank you, Babak. I think it's a good word for the end of the panel and the discussion. I thank you very much. It was very impressive and very interesting. Thank you very much to all the panelists, to the audience, and to Costa and Stefan for the excellent preparation and organization.
Thank you, everybody. So I will now pause the recordings and we will have 5 minutes breaks before we will introduce the work of the second panel. Thank you so much.